Welcome to Kindness in Real Life. What if a millionaire's cold cash for kid deal with a homeless woman turned into something he never saw coming? Here's a taste to hook you. The ultrasound wand glided over Elodie's belly, a single heartbeat thumping. Then Dr. Ellis paused, his brow furrowing. Wait. Three tiny shapes pulsed on the screen. There are three heartbeats. You're expecting triplets. James sank into a chair, his gray eyes wide, his perfect plan tripling in an instant. Three lives he couldn't control. How does a man who swore off love handle a miracle that rewrites his world? Stick around to find out. If this chaos stirs your heart, smash that like button and subscribe to Kindness in Real Life for more stories that spark hope. The penthouse gleamed like a polished jewel atop Manhattan's Upper East Side, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a skyline swallowed by fog. James Harrington stood at the edge of the glass, his broad shoulders squared against the gray haze outside. At 45, he was a man carved from ambition. 6 feet tall, with fair skin weathered by years of calculated risks, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His gray eyes, sharp as steel, traced the silhouettes of skyscrapers piercing the mist, their lights flickering like distant stars. He wore a tailored black suit, crisp and unyielding, a uniform of power that matched the cold elegance of his surroundings. Marble floors, sleek leather furniture, a single abstract painting slashing red across a white wall. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city 80 stories below, a restless murmur of millions he'd never truly know. James sipped a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the dim glow of a crystal chandelier. It burned his throat, a fleeting warmth against the hollow ache in his chest. He had everything: a fortune built on stock market conquests, a name etched in the granite of boardrooms, a Lamborghini Diablo purring in the garage below. Yet, as he stared into the fog, the towers around him felt like mirrors, empty, reflecting a life of triumphs that rang hollow. "I've got it all," he muttered to himself, his voice low and clipped, a businessman's drawl honed by decades of deals. Everything but what matters. His fingers tightened around the glass. 2 marriages had crumbled behind him, brittle unions with women who loved his wealth, not him. Love, with its messy chaos, was a sea he'd vowed never to sail again. Too risky, too unpredictable. What he wanted was simpler, cleaner, a child. Not a wife tethered by fragile vows, but an heir to carry his name when the lights of his empire dimmed. The bourbon glass clinked as he set it on a polished table, his gaze drifting to a framed photo. Himself at 30, grinning beside a jet in Dubai, the world at his feet. Back then, he'd thought success would fill the void. Now, at 45, he knew better. Un enfant de mon âme, he whispered, the French rolling off his tongue, a remnant of years as a polyglot globetrotter. A child of his soul. That's what he craved, a seed to plant, a legacy to outlast him. He turned from the window, the penthouse's stillness pressing against him like a weight. The city never slept, but up here, time felt frozen, trapped in the sterile perfection he'd built. Every deal closed, every dollar stacked, was a star dimming in the vast dark of his inner world. He didn't need love storms. After his ex-wives, Caroline with her diamond demands, Vanessa with her staged tears, he'd sworn off emotional disasters. A child, though, that was tangible, a successor. No complications, no heartbreak, just lineage. The clock struck noon, its chime cutting through his thoughts. James grabbed his coat, a sleek black trench over his suit, and headed for the private elevator, its doors sliding shut with a whisper. Downstairs, the Lamborghini waited, its curves glinting under fluorescent lights, a beast of speed and status. He slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool against his palms, and roared into the congested streets of New York. Traffic snarled around Central Park, horns blaring like a discordant symphony. James drummed his fingers on the wheel, irritation flickering in his gray eyes as he stopped at a red light. The city pulsed outside, taxis weaving, pedestrians darting, the air thick with exhaust and ambition. Then, A shadow moved at his window. He turned, his jaw tightening as a figure emerged from the chaos. A young woman, her pale skin smudged with dirt, her dark hair a tangled mess spilling over her shoulders. She was small, maybe 5 feet 3 inches, her frame thin under a threadbare coat that hung like a sack. Her piercing blue eyes locked onto his, a storm of resignation and hope swirling in their depths. She extended a trembling hand, her voice barely audible over the street's din. "Anything for me?" she asked, her French accent faint but unmistakable. James's lip curled, a flash of annoyance crossing his chiseled face. "Get lost," he snapped, his tone sharp as a blade. The light turned green, and he gunned the engine, the Lamborghini surging forward, leaving her in a blur of exhaust. Why waste time on misery? He thought, his grip tightening on the wheel. My life's too planned for this nonsense. But as he sped through the streets, her eyes haunted him, blue like a wounded sky, cutting through his detachment. He'd seen thousands like her, shadows blending into the city's noise, but something about her stuck, a chord he couldn't name. 3 blocks later, his foot eased off the gas. He cursed under his breath, his hands flexing against the leather. "Damn it," he muttered, yanking the wheel to turn back. The Lamborghini growled as he retraced his path, weaving through traffic until he spotted her again, huddled near the park, her coat flapping in the wind. He pulled to the curb, the engine idling like a predator at rest, and rolled down the window. "Get in," he said, his voice cold, a command, not a question. She stepped back, suspicion etching lines into her pale face. Her blue eyes narrowed, scanning him, his suit, his car, the hard set of his jaw. Life on the streets had taught her caution. "I'm not that kind of woman," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the French lilt stronger now. James raised an eyebrow, his gray eyes glinting with impatience. "You think I'd want that from you?" he retorted, his tone cutting. "You don't look remotely appealing enough to tempt me. You're safe. Now get in. I don't have all day. Or would you rather freeze out there?" She blinked, caught off guard by his bluntness. Her shoulders slumped slightly, resignation softening her defiance. After a beat, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, her movements slow, wary. The leather creaked under her weight, her coat a stark contrast to the car's pristine interior. The engine purred as James merged back into traffic, the city swallowing them whole. Silence stretched between them, heavy and taut. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Young, maybe 28, her pale skin marked by hardship, her hands clasped tight in her lap. She stared ahead, her blue eyes fixed on the windshield, lost in thoughts he couldn't guess. Finally, he broke the quiet, his voice calm, transactional, the same tone he used to close a merger. "I'm making you an offer," he said, his gaze flicking to the road. "It'll change your life. I want a child, not a wife, not a relationship, just a child. I'll pay you a fortune, cover everything during the pregnancy. All I need is your womb. After, you walk away." Her head snapped toward him, her blue eyes widening, disbelief flashing across her face. "A child?" she echoed, her voice trembling, as if the word carried a weight she couldn't lift. "You said you wouldn't touch me." "Artificial insemination," he replied, his tone matter of fact. "Nothing else. It's practical, clean. What did you think?" She fell silent, the city's roar fading as her mind churned. James kept driving, his hands steady on the wheel, but her quiet gnawed at him. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice still detached. "And what are you running from?" "Elodie Moreau," she said after a pause, her accent thickening with emotion. "I'm French. Came here 5 years ago for a future that never came. Now I'm just lost." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the frayed edge of her coat. "Running from everything, this city, my failures, myself." James nodded, his gray eyes unreadable. "Then this is your way out," he said. "Take it or leave it." The Lamborghini hummed beneath them, carrying them deeper into the city, and into a deal that would unravel everything he thought he knew. The Lamborghini Diablo purred through Manhattan's labyrinth of steel and glass, its sleek frame slicing the dusk like a blade. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the hum of the engine a low growl beneath the silence. James Harrington gripped the wheel, his broad 6-foot frame rigid in the driver's seat, his tailored black suit creasing slightly at the elbows. His fair skin glowed faintly under the dashboard lights, his silver-streaked dark hair catching shadows as his gray eyes flicked between the road and the woman beside him. At 45, he exuded control, every line of his chiseled face etched with the certainty of a man who'd mastered his world. Elodie Morrow sat in the passenger seat, her small 5 feet 3 inches frame swallowed by the leather upholstery. Her pale skin looked almost translucent in the dim light, smudged with the grime of the streets, her dark hair a tangled cascade over her threadbare coat. Her piercing blue eyes, sharp, wounded, stared out the window, tracing the blur of skyscrapers against the deepening sky. At 28, she carried the weight of a life unraveled, her thin hands clasped tight in her lap, her lips pressed into a line of quiet resolve. James's offer hung between them like a storm cloud, cold, calculated, impossible to ignore. A child, he'd said, his voice clipped and transactional, as if negotiating a stock deal. I'll pay you a fortune. You carry it, you leave. Simple. Elodie hadn't responded. Not yet. Her breath fogged the window, her silence louder than the city's roar outside. The car slowed as they approached his Upper East Side mansion, a fortress of marble and steel rising from the street like a monument to his wealth. The garage doors slid open with a whisper, and James guided the Lamborghini inside, its engine falling silent as he cut the ignition. He turned to her, his gray eyes narrowing. "We're here," he said, his tone flat. "Get out." Elodie hesitated, her blue eyes darting to him, suspicion flickering across her pale face. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the polished concrete, her worn sneakers scuffing against the pristine floor. James followed, his trench coat flaring as he strode toward an elevator at the garage's edge. "This way," he commanded, not looking back. The elevator hummed upward, its mirrored walls reflecting their stark contrast. James, towering and immaculate, his suit a shield of power. Elodie, small and frayed, her coat hanging like a shroud. She kept her gaze down, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve, while James stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The doors opened into a sprawling living room, white marble floors stretching to a wall of windows, the city's lights twinkling beyond like a sea of fireflies. Minimalist furniture gleamed under a chandelier's soft glow, but the space felt cold, lifeless, a museum more than a home. "Sit," James said, gesturing to a leather sofa. He shed his coat, draping it over a chair, and crossed to a bar in the corner, pouring himself another bourbon. Elodie perched on the edge of the sofa, her thin frame tense, her blue eyes scanning the room. Paintings worth millions, a staircase spiraling upward, the faint scent of polish lingering in the air. She looked out of place, a smudge of reality in his sterile world. He leaned against the bar, swirling the bourbon in his glass, his gray eyes fixed on her. "Let's cut to it," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'm serious about the offer. $1 million, half now, half when it's done. You'll live here, eat well, see the best doctors. After the birth, you take the money and go. No strings." Elodie's head snapped up, her blue eyes widening, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "1 million, she whispered, her French accent thickening with emotion. "For a child I'll never know." Her hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles whitening. James shrugged, his expression impassive. "It's a transaction. You need money. I need an heir. Artificial insemination. No mess, no complications. You're free when it's over." He took a sip of bourbon, the ice clinking against the glass. "You said you're lost. This gets you back to France, doesn't it? A new start." She looked away, her gaze drifting to the windows, the city's lights blurring through a sheen of unshed tears. "France," she murmured, her voice soft, heavy. "I came here with dreams. Art school, a gallery, a life. 5 years, and all I have is this coat and these streets." Her fingers brushed the frayed fabric, her lips trembling. "Now you want my womb, like it's a thing to rent." James's jaw twitched, a flicker of something, irritation, unease, crossing his face. "It's practical," he said, his tone hardening. "I don't need a wife. I've had two, and they were disasters. Love's a lie people tell to get what they want. This is cleaner. You give me a child, I give you freedom. We both win." Elodie's blue eyes met his, piercing through his armor. "Freedom," she echoed, her voice laced with bitter irony. "You think money buys that? I'd carry a life, feel it grow, hear its heart, and then walk away. What kind of freedom is that?" He set the glass down with a sharp clink, stepping closer, his gray eyes narrowing. "The kind that gets you off the streets," he said, his voice cold but steady. "You're freezing out there, begging for scraps. This is a roof, food, a future. Take it or leave it." She flinched, her pale face tightening, but she didn't look away. "You're so sure of everything," she said, her voice low, cutting. "A man in a tower, buying what he wants. But a child isn't a stock. It's not yours to own." James paused, her words striking a nerve he didn't expect. He turned to the window, his broad frame silhouetted against the skyline, his hands sliding into his pockets. "It's mine to protect," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. "A name to carry on when I'm gone. That's all I've got left." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Elodie studied him, his rigid stance, the faint slump of his shoulders, the bourbon abandoned on the bar. For a moment, she saw past the suit, past the millionaire, to a man hollowed out by his own success. Her blue eyes softened, just a fraction. "I need time," she said finally, her voice steady but fragile. "To think." James turned, his gray eyes meeting hers, a flicker of surprise breaking his mask. "Fine," he said, nodding curtly. "Stay here tonight. Clean up, eat, whatever you need. We'll talk tomorrow." He gestured to a hallway. "Guest room's that way." She rose, her movements slow, wary, clutching her coat like a shield. As she passed him, her blue eyes flicked up, searching his face. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have picked anyone." He didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting to the floor. "Your eyes," he said at last, his tone clipped, reluctant. "They stayed with me." Elodie blinked, caught off guard, then turned and disappeared down the hall. James stood alone, the city's lights casting long shadows across the marble. He grabbed the bourbon again, downing it in one swallow, the burn a fleeting distraction from the unease creeping into his chest. Upstairs, Elodie stepped into a guest room. Soft white linens, a window overlooking the park, a bathroom gleaming with marble. She shed her coat, her thin frame shivering in a worn sweater and jeans. The mirror showed a stranger, pale, hollow-cheeked, her blue eyes bright against the shadows under them. She ran a hand through her tangled hair, whispering to herself in French, "La misère n'est pas de fin." Misery has no end. But as she sank onto the bed, the softness beneath her a stark contrast to the streets. A single thought pierced the dark. Maybe this is my way out. Downstairs, James stared at the empty glass, the city humming beyond the glass, and wondered why her eyes wouldn't leave him alone. The Upper East Side mansion woke to a dawn painted in soft pinks and golds, the sunlight spilling through towering windows to dance across marble floors. James Harrington stood in his office, a grand room of dark wood and leather-bound books, his broad 6-foot frame silhouetted against the skyline. At 45, his fair skin bore the faint lines of a life spent chasing power, his silver-streaked dark hair swept back, his gray eyes fixed on a contract spread across his desk. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and charcoal slacks, less formal than his usual suit but no less commanding. His chiseled face was set in a mask of focus, though a flicker of unease lingered in his gaze. Down the hall, Elodie Moreau emerged from the guest room, her small 5 feet 3 inches frame wrapped in a borrowed robe of soft gray cotton, too large for her thin build. Her pale skin glowed faintly after a night's rest, scrubbed clean of the street's grime, her dark hair falling in damp waves past her shoulders from shower. At 28, her piercing blue eyes, sharp as fractured glass, swept the room, her lips pressed into a thoughtful line. She clutched the robe's edges, her bare feet silent on the cool floor, her expression a mix of resolve and quiet dread. The scent of coffee drifted from the kitchen, where a housekeeper, Stephanie, a stout woman with kind brown eyes, set out a tray of croissants and fruit. James had barked orders the night before. Make her presentable. Food, clothes, whatever she needs. Now, Elodie stood at the threshold, her blue eyes catching the morning light as she watched Stephanie bustle about. The warmth of the scene clashed with the cold deal echoing in her mind. $1 million for a child she'd never hold. James appeared in the doorway, his gray eyes locking onto her. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice low, clipped, a businessman assessing a client. Elodie nodded, her fingers tightening on the robe. "Better than the streets," she said, her French accent soft but steady. She stepped forward, her gaze flicking to the tray. "I've thought about your offer." He raised an eyebrow, leaning against the frame, his broad shoulders filling the space. And she took a deep breath, her blue eyes meeting his, unflinching. "I'll do it," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray the weight of her words. $1 million. Your child. Then I'm gone." James's face remained impassive, but a spark flared in his gray eyes. Satisfaction, relief, something he couldn't name. "Good," he said, straightening. "We'll sign today. My lawyer's on his way." He gestured to the tray. "Eat. You'll need it." Elodie sat, her thin hands reaching for a croissant, the buttery flakes crumbling under her fingers. She ate slowly, the richness a shock after months of scraps, her blue eyes darting to James as he poured himself coffee. The kitchen gleamed, stainless steel, white tiles, a vase of lilies perfuming the air. But it felt like a stage, every move scripted by his wealth. "You're sure?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost hesitant. He leaned against the counter, the coffee steaming in his grip, his gray eyes studying her pale face. "This isn't a small thing." She swallowed, setting the croissant down, her hands folding in her lap. "I've got nothing left," she said, her voice low, raw. "No home, no dreams, just cold streets and empty promises. It's a way out. Back to France. I'll survive it." Her blue eyes hardened, a flicker of defiance breaking through. "But don't think I'll forget what I'm giving up." James nodded, his jaw tightening. Her words stung, though he wouldn't admit it. He'd framed this as a transaction. Clean, logical, but her quiet strength unsettled him. A crack in his armor he didn't expect. "Fair enough," he said, turning away to hide the flicker of doubt in his gaze. "We'll keep it professional." An hour later, the lawyer arrived, Tom Grayson, a wiry man in his 50s with thinning gray hair and a pinstripe suit, his brown eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He spread the contract across the office desk, its pages crisp and heavy with legal jargon. James sat in a leather chair, his broad frame relaxed but alert, his gray eyes scanning the terms. Elodie stood opposite, her small frame dwarfed by the room, her robe swapped for a simple blue dress Stephanie had found. Too big, but clean, its hem brushing her knees. Tom's voice droned, precise and dry. $1 million, payable in 2 installments. Half upon signing, half post-delivery. Artificial insemination, full medical care, residency here until birth. Postpartum, Ms. Moreau relinquishes all rights and departs within 90 days. He glanced at Elodie, his brow furrowing. "Any questions?" Her blue eyes flicked to the paper, then to James. 90 days, she murmured, her voice barely audible. "After I leave them." James met her gaze, his gray eyes steady. "That's the deal," he said, his tone firm but quieter than usual. "You're free after that. Money in hand, back to France, or wherever you want." She nodded, her pale face tightening, her hands clenching at her sides. "And you?" she asked, her voice cutting through the room's stillness. What do you get out of this, besides a name? He leaned back, his fingers drumming the armrest, a rare pause softening his chiseled features. A legacy, he said at last, his voice low, almost reverent. Something that lasts. I've built an empire, money, power, but it's dust without someone to carry it forward. Elodie's blue eyes held his, searching, then dropped to the contract. She picked up the pen, her thin fingers trembling as she signed. Elodie Moreau, the ink stark against the white page. James followed, his broad hand steady, his signature a bold slash. James Harrington. Tom collected the papers, nodding curtly. It's done, he said, slipping them into a briefcase. I'll file it today. The lawyer left, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving James and Elodie alone in the office. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of what they'd just sealed. James stood, his gray eyes flicking to her. First steps the clinic, he said, his tone brisk again. Tomorrow. Tests, prep, make sure everything's set. Elodie rose, her small frame rigid, her blue eyes distant. Tomorrow, she echoed, her voice hollow. She turned to leave, then paused, glancing back. You're not as cold as you think, she said, her French accent curling around the words. Not yet. James froze, her words slicing through his detachment. He opened his mouth to retort, but she was already gone, her figure disappearing into the hallway shadows. He sank back into the chair, his broad hands rubbing his face, the contract's edges still sharp under his fingers. That night, the mansion hummed with quiet. Elodie lay in the guest room, the bed's softness a stark contrast to the street's hardness, her blue eyes tracing the ceiling's patterns. She whispered to herself in French, un enfant de mon âme, echoing James's words, her hand resting on her stomach. The thought of a life growing there, his life, stirred a mix of dread and strange warmth she couldn't name. Downstairs, James stood at the penthouse window, the city's lights sprawling below like a living map. His gray eyes softened, just for a moment, as he replayed her words, not as cold as you think. He downed a bourbon, the burn sharp, but it couldn't drown the unease creeping into his chest. The deal was set, the seed planted. Not in her yet, but in his mind, shifting something he'd long buried. Outside, the skyline glowed, indifferent to the pact forged within these walls. A pact that, unbeknownst to them, would soon grow roots deeper than either could imagine. The Upper East Side mansion shimmered under a late spring sun, its marble facade catching the light like a polished shell. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of antiseptic and lavender, a sterile calm settling over the guest wing now transformed into Elodie Moreau's domain. She stood by a window, her small 5 feet 3 inches frame softened by 3 months of pregnancy, her pale skin glowing with a faint flush. At 28, her dark hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, framing her piercing blue eyes, sharp yet weary, tracing the skyline beyond the glass. She wore a simple white dress, its fabric loose over her growing belly, her thin hands resting gently on the curve, her lips parted in a quiet, thoughtful breath. James Harrington paced the living room downstairs, his broad 6-foot figure cutting through the space like a restless shadow. At 45, his fair skin bore the tension of weeks spent watching Elodie change, his silver-streaked dark hair swept back, his gray eyes flickering with a mix of control and unease. He wore a navy blazer over a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, his chiseled face set in a mask of focus. The contract sat framed on a shelf, a cold pact now warming with life, its terms etched in his mind as the city hummed beyond the windows. The fertility clinic had become their ritual, its sleek silver sign a beacon of precision on Manhattan's polished streets. That first day, months ago, had been clinical, cold gel, white walls, the hum of machines as the insemination took root. Elodie had lain still, her blue eyes fixed on the ceiling, while James stood by the door, his gray gaze locked on the screen, his broad hands in his pockets. Success came swiftly, confirmed by a single heartbeat weeks later. But today was different, Today, the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. James drove the Lamborghini Diablo in silence, its engine a low roar beneath their tension. Elodie sat beside him, her small frame cradled by the leather, her white dress stark against the black interior. Her blue eyes stared out the window, the city blurring past in streaks of steel and glass. Her hands folded over her belly. "It's moving," she said suddenly, her voice soft, breaking the quiet. "I felt it last night." He glanced at her, his gray eyes narrowing, a flicker of surprise softening his hard features. "Already?" he asked, his tone clipped but curious. "What's it like?" Her lips curved, a faint smile breaking through her weariness. "Like a whisper," she said, her French accent curling around the words. "A little flutter, telling me it's there." She looked down, her blue eyes glowing with something tender, unguarded. James's hands tightened on the wheel, his jaw twitching. He'd planned this, paid for it, scripted it. But her words stirred something raw, a crack in his calculated world. "Good," he said, his voice gruff, eyes back on the road. "Means it's working." The clinic loomed ahead, its glass doors parting as they entered, the lobby a sterile expanse of white and chrome. A gynecologist, Dr. Ellis, a lean man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and calm green eyes, greeted them, his lab coat crisp over a gray suit. "Mr. Harrington, Ms. Moreau," he said, his voice steady, leading them to an exam room. "Let's see how things are progressing." Elodie lay on the table, her small frame tense under a thin sheet, her blue eyes flicking to the monitor. James stood by the wall, his broad shoulders rigid, his gray gaze locked on the screen as Dr. Ellis spread gel across her belly. The room fell silent, the ultrasound wand gliding over her skin, until a sound broke through, a rapid, rhythmic thump like rain on a tin roof. Elodie's breath caught, her hands clenching the sheet, her blue eyes widening. "There's the heartbeat," Dr. Ellis said, his green eyes scanning the monitor, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Strong, steady." He adjusted the wand, then paused, his brow furrowing. "Wait." James stepped closer, his gray eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice sharp, a rare edge of concern breaking through. Dr. Ellis tilted the screen, pointing to 3 tiny shapes pulsing in unison. "It's not just one," he said, his tone measured but warm. "There are 3 heartbeats. Congratulations, you're expecting triplets." The room froze. Elodie's blue eyes filled with tears, her pale face lighting with a mix of shock and joy, her hands trembling as they pressed against her belly. "3," she whispered, her voice breaking, a sob escaping her lips. "3 lives?" James stared at the screen, his broad frame still, his gray eyes wide with something unreadable. Disbelief, awe, a tremor of something deeper. 3 heartbeats, 3 heirs. His plan had tripled, and with it, the weight of what he'd set in motion. He sank into a chair, his hands gripping the armrests, his chiseled face paling. "Triplets," he muttered, almost to himself, his voice low, shaken. Dr. Ellis smiled, adjusting the wand to capture the tiny forms. 2 boys, a girl, their outlines faint but real. "Everything looks healthy," he said, a rarity but a blessing. He handed Elodie a tissue, her tears streaming freely now, her blue eyes locked on the screen. James rose, his gray eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, their worlds collided, his cold ambition crashing against her raw emotion. He reached out, his broad hand brushing her shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic it startled them both. "You're okay?" he asked, his voice softer, uncertain. She nodded, wiping her eyes, her pale face radiant despite the tears. "They're perfect," she said, her French accent thick with wonder. "I feel them, all of them." Her hands cradled her belly, her blue eyes glowing with a love she couldn't hide. The drive back was quiet, the Lamborghinis roar a distant hum beneath their thoughts. James's gray eyes flicked to her, her small frame curled against the seat, her hands still on her belly. 3, he said at last, his voice low, testing the word. Changes things. Elodie turned, her blue eyes searching his face. Does it? She asked, her tone gentle but probing. For you, it's still a deal, isn't it? 3 names instead of 1. He didn't answer right away, his hands flexing on the wheel, the city's lights flashing across his chiseled features. It's more now, he admitted, his voice rough, reluctant. More than I planned. She smiled faintly, her pale face softening. Children aren't plans, she said, her words cutting through his armor. Their lives, they change you. James's jaw tightened, her truth sinking deeper than he wanted. Back at the mansion, he stood at the window, the skyline sprawling below, his gray eyes distant. 3 heartbeats echoed in his mind, a rhythm he couldn't shake. He'd built this, paid for it, but it was slipping beyond his control, rooting into something alive, unpredictable. Upstairs, Elodie sat on her bed, the ultrasound printout in her hands. 3 tiny shapes, 3 beating hearts. Her blue eyes traced them, tears welling again as she whispered in French. Mes petits miracles. My little miracles. She pressed the paper to her chest, her pale face alight with a love she hadn't expected, a bond no contract could sever. That night, James lingered outside her door, his broad hand hovering over the knob. He didn't knock, just listened, the faint sound of her breathing seeping through the wood. His gray eyes softened, a crack widening in his cold facade. 3 lives. Her life. And somehow his... He turned away, the bourbon untouched on the bar, the city's hum a distant echo to the storm brewing within him. Outside, the skyline glittered, indifferent to the pact, now pulsing with triple the life and triple the stakes they'd never foreseen. The Upper East Side mansion glowed under a crisp autumn dusk, its marble walls awash in the golden hues of falling leaves. Inside, the air thrummed with anticipation. The guest wing, now a sanctuary of soft whites and pastel blues, its windows framing a skyline ablaze with city lights. Elodie Moreau stood by her bed, her small 5 feet 3 inches frame heavy with 9 months of pregnancy, her pale skin radiant with exhaustion and hope. At 28, her dark hair spilled in loose curls over her shoulders, her piercing blue eyes, bright with resolve, fixed on the cribs lining the wall. She wore a flowing cream gown, its fabric draping her swollen belly, her thin hands trembling as she clutched a suitcase, her lips parting in a shaky breath. James Harrington paced the hallway outside, his broad 6-foot figure taut with tension, his fair skin flushed from sleepless nights. At 45, his silver-streaked dark hair was tousled, his gray eyes flickering with a storm of emotions, control slipping through his fingers. He wore a rumpled gray sweater over slacks, a far cry from his usual suits, his chiseled face etched with worry. The contract, once his shield, sat crumpled in a drawer, its terms unraveling as the triplets' arrival loomed. The past months had shifted everything. Elodie's pregnancy had filled the mansion with life, her soft laughter echoing through the halls, her blue eyes glowing as she felt the baby's move. James had watched, his gray gaze softening with each passing day, his cold detachment melting under her warmth. He'd carried her upstairs one night, her dizziness sparking a tenderness he couldn't name, his broad arms cradling her small frame as she whispered, "You don't have to." But he did, again and again, drawn to her in ways he'd never planned. Now the moment had come. Elodie's voice cut through the quiet, faint but urgent. "James," she called, her tone trembling. "It's time." He burst into the room, his gray eyes wide, finding her doubled over, her pale face tight with pain. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady despite the panic in his chest, rushing to her side. He scooped her up, her cream gown trailing as he carried her to the Lamborghini, its engine roaring to life. The hospital loomed ahead, its glass facade glinting under sodium lights. James gripped her hand in the delivery room, his broad frame hunched beside her, his gray eyes locked on her pale face as she breathed through contractions. "You're doing amazing," he murmured, his voice soft, raw, his fingers tightening around hers. Elodie's blue eyes met his, a flicker of trust breaking through her pain, her lips curving in a faint smile. Hours stretched, each cry a milestone. The first, a boy, his wail piercing the sterile air, slid into the world, his tiny body red and wriggling. James's throat tightened, his gray eyes misting as the nurse placed the baby in a blanket. Then the second, another boy, quieter, his small fists clenched. Finally, the third, a girl, her cry soft but fierce, her dark hair a whisper against her scalp. Elodie sobbed, her blue eyes streaming with joy, her trembling hands reaching for them as the nurses cradled the triplets. "They're perfect," she whispered, her voice breaking, her pale face alight with love. James sank to his knees beside her, his broad hands gripping the bed's edge, his gray eyes fixed on the three tiny lives, his heirs, her miracles. Tears spilled down his chiseled cheeks, a flood he couldn't stop, his voice cracking as he whispered, "3, my God, 3. He looked at Elodie, her blue eyes meeting his, and saw not just the woman he'd hired, but the heart that had reshaped him. But joy turned bitter as the contract's shadow fell. Elodie's tears shifted, her pale face crumpling with sorrow. "I have to leave them," she sobbed, her hands brushing the girl's cheek. "It's the deal. I'll honor it, but it's tearing me apart." James froze, her pain slicing through him, the cold terms of their pact now ash in his mouth. He kissed her forehead, his lips trembling, a lump choking his words. The next morning, Dawn painted the hospital room gold, flowers from Tom Grayson, James's lawyer, filling the air with sweetness. Elodie rested, her small frame fragile against the pillows, her blue eyes peaceful yet shadowed. James had stayed by her side, his gray gaze tracing her as she slept, his broad hand never leaving hers. But when he returned from a quick errand, he stopped cold. Tom sat by her bed, his wiry frame leaning close, his brown eyes soft as he held her hand. "Antoinette, will you marry me?" Tom asked, a ring glinting in his grip. James pushed the door open, his gray eyes blazing, his voice icy. "Tom, what the hell is this?" Tom rose, calm but defiant, his pinstripe suit crisp. "She deserves more than a contract, James. I love her." Elodie blinked, her blue eyes wide with shock, her pale face caught between them. "Please," she whispered, "not now." Tom left, but the tension lingered, a crack in James's world he couldn't mend. 3 months later, the mansion was a symphony of cries and coos, the triplets, Henry, Lucas, and Claire, filling it with life. Elodie packed her suitcase, her small frame trembling as she kissed each baby goodbye, her blue eyes streaming with tears. "I'll never forget you," she whispered, her voice breaking, her pale hands clutching their tiny blankets. The contract loomed, 90 days, then gone. She descended the grand staircase, her cream dress swaying, her suitcase dragging behind her. At the door, her hand gripped the knob, her blue eyes fixed on the freedom she'd bargained for, and the loss it carried. Then James's voice thundered. "Elodie, where are you going?" She froze, her pale face turning as he stormed closer, his gray eyes wild with fear. "It's Tom, isn't it? You love him." "No," she snapped, her voice raw, tears spilling. "It's the contract. You made me promise to leave." James stopped, his broad frame heaving, then pulled the contract from his pocket. With a surge of fury, he tore it to shreds, the pieces fluttering to the marble floor. He dropped to his knees, his gray eyes pleading. "Stay," he begged, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. Love's not a lie. You taught me that. I love you, Elodie. Stay for them, for us." Her blue eyes widened, disbelief melting into tenderness. She knelt, her thin hands cupping his face, her voice soft. "It's always been you, James. Since that first day on the street." He stared, his gray eyes shining, then pulled her close, his broad arms enveloping her small frame. "Marry me," He whispered, his lips brushing hers. Be my wife, my family. She nodded, tears mingling with laughter, and they kissed, deep, fierce, a vow beyond paper. Months later, the mansion rang with wedding bells, its halls alive with guests and joy. Elodie stood radiant in a lace gown, her blue eyes glowing as she held Claire, while James, in a gray suit, cradled Henry and Lucas, his gray eyes warm with love. The triplets babbled, their tiny hands reaching, a testament to a deal that blossomed into something eternal. James looked at Elodie, his chiseled face soft, and knew he'd found more than an heir, a soul, a home. Outside, the skyline glittered, a witness to their pact, not of wealth, but of hearts entwined forever. The Upper East Side mansion basked in the soft glow of a summer evening, its marble walls softened by ivy creeping up the facade. Inside, laughter spilled from the living room, a warm symphony weaving through the air. Elodie Harrington, née Moreau, sat cross-legged on a plush rug, her small 5 feet 3 inches frame vibrant with the ease of motherhood. At 29, her pale skin shimmered with a healthy flush, her dark hair tied in a loose bun, tendrils framing her piercing blue eyes, bright with joy as she watched her triplets toddle about. She wore a light yellow sundress, its hem dusted with crumbs from a cookie she'd shared with the children, her thin hands clapping as they giggled. James Harrington leaned against the doorway, his broad 6-foot figure relaxed, a rare softness easing the lines of his chiseled face. At 46, his fair skin carried a faint tan from park outings, his silver-streaked dark hair tousled from chasing little feet, his gray eyes warm with a love he'd never thought possible. He wore a casual linen shirt and jeans, sleeves rolled up, a stark shift from the suits of his past. The triplets, Henry, Lucas, and Claire, now 18 months old, darted around him, their sandy curls bouncing, their green eyes, his eyes, sparkling with mischief. The room was a chaos of color, wooden blocks scattered across the rug, a stuffed bear perched on the sofa, finger-painted drawings taped to the walls. The mansion, once a cold fortress, now pulsed with life, its marble floors scuffed by tiny sneakers, its silence replaced by squeals and the clatter of toys. Elodie scooped Claire into her lap, the girl's chubby hands tugging at her mother's hair, while Henry and Lucas tackled James's legs, their laughter a melody that drowned out the city's hum beyond the windows. "Look at you," Elodie said, her blue eyes flicking to James, her French accent curling with amusement. A millionaire wrestling with toddlers. Who'd have thought? He grinned, a rare, unguarded smile breaking his stern features, hoisting Lucas onto his shoulder. "Better than boardrooms," he said, his voice low, rich with contentment. "These three run a tighter ship than any CEO." He ruffled Henry's curls, his gray eyes meeting Elodie's, a silent vow passing between them. "This is ours." Their wedding, 6 months past, had sealed a love born from ashes, a quiet ceremony in the mansion's garden, the triplets babbling through vows, petals strewn by tiny hands. James had traded his empire's edge for this, a family, a legacy not of wealth but of warmth. Elodie had blossomed, her blue eyes no longer shadowed by the streets, her pale face alight with purpose. They'd named the triplets together, Henry for strength, Lucas for light, Claire for clarity, each a piece of the bond they'd forged. But peace, like summer, could shift with the wind. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, a knock rattled the front door, sharp and insistent. James set Lucas down, his gray eyes narrowing, a flicker of his old guardedness returning. Elodie rose, Claire in her arms, her blue eyes curious as she followed him to the hall. Tom Grayson stood on the threshold, his wiry frame tense in a pinstripe suit, his thinning gray hair slicked back, his brown eyes sharp behind glasses. At 51, he carried the weight of a man who'd lost something vital, his lips pressed into a thin line. "James," he said, his voice clipped, nodding curtly. "Elodie." James's broad shoulders stiffened, his gray eyes icing over. Tom, he said, his tone flat, a wall rising. What do you want? Tom's gaze flicked to Elodie, softening for a moment, then back to James. I need to talk, he said, stepping inside uninvited, his briefcase thudding against the marble. It's about the triplets. Elodie's blue eyes widened, her pale face paling further, her arms tightening around Claire. What about them? She asked, her voice trembling, the French lilt sharp with fear. James stepped forward, his broad hand resting on her shoulder, his gray eyes boring into Tom. Spit it out, he snapped, his voice low, dangerous. Tom opened his briefcase, pulling out a sheaf of papers, yellowed, stamped with legal seals. There's a clause, he said, his tone measured but edged, from the original contract. It's buried in fine print, custody contingencies. If Elodie left within 90 days, full rights went to you, James. But she stayed. That triggers a review. I've been digging. It could mean a claim. A claim. James's voice rose, his gray eyes blazing, his broad frame towering over Tom. You're saying someone can take them? Tom held up a hand, his brown eyes steady. Not someone me, he said, his voice dropping. I drafted it, James. How about standing? I watched you build this, and he paused, glancing at Elodie, his gaze raw. I love her. I always have. I could give them a life, too. Elodie gasped, her blue eyes flashing with fury, her pale face flushing red. You'd use our children? She spat, her voice shaking, stepping closer with Claire clinging to her. This isn't love, it's revenge. James's fists clenched, his gray eyes darkening to storm clouds. You think you can waltz in here and tear this apart? He growled, his broad hand slamming the papers to the floor. They're mine, ours. You've got no claim, Tom. Not legally, not morally. Tom straightened, his wiry frame unyielding, his brown eyes glinting. I've got proof, he said, tapping the briefcase. Courts love fine print. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to negotiate. Step aside, James. Let me have her or them. You've won enough. The room crackled, the triplets' laughter fading as Henry and Lucas toddled to Elodie, sensing the shift. She knelt, gathering them close, her blue eyes blazing up at Tom. You don't know love, she said, her voice low, cutting. It's not a deal to win. It's this messy real ours. James stepped between them, his broad frame a shield, his gray eyes locked on Tom. Get out, he said, his voice a quiet thunder. You've got nothing but paper. This family's mine, heart, soul, everything. Try me in court, and I'll bury you. Tom hesitated, his brown eyes flickering, then nodded curtly. We'll see, he said, grabbing his briefcase and retreating, the door slamming behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Claire's soft whimper. Elodie stood, her pale face trembling, her blue eyes meeting James's. He can't. Can he? She whispered, her voice cracking. James pulled her close, his broad arms enveloping her and the triplets, his gray eyes fierce with promise. Never, he said, his voice steady raw. I tore that contract for us. No one takes this. He kissed her forehead, his lips lingering, the warmth of his breath grounding her. That night, the mansion settled into a fragile calm. Elodie sat by the cribs, her blue eyes tracing the sleeping triplets. Henry's tiny snores, Lucas's curled fist, Claire's peaceful sigh. James joined her, his broad hand resting on her shoulder, his gray eyes soft. We'll fight, he said, his voice low, resolute. Together. She nodded, her pale hand covering his, her blue eyes shining with tears and strength. Always, she whispered, her French accent thick with love. You my home, James, them you. Outside, the skyline glittered, a witness to their bond, forged not in ink, but in the chaos and beauty of a family unyielding. Tom's threat faded into the night, a shadow against the light they'd built, a light no court could dim.